Sweden, much like England, underwent a Protestant Reformation in the 16th century, and the Church of Sweden is now a Lutheran church. The Swedish Reformation was a long and drawn-out affair. Beginning in the 1520s, it was not really concluded until 1593, when Lutheranism became the state religion. Like the Church of England, this new Reformed church rejected the cult of saints and the veneration of saints' relics that had been an important aspect of Catholic tradition and devotion. For the most part, Swedish churches were purged of any shrines, relics and reliquaries in the 1530s. However, as in England, there are a few notable exceptions to this near wholesale destruction of this aspect of Catholic culture. What are believed to be the relics of the mystics St. Bridget of Sweden are still to be found at the monastery she founded in Vadstena. The most remarkable survival, however, is in Uppsala Cathedral, where towards the east end of the church, in a north side chapel, you will find a shrine that purports to contain the relics of St. Erik of Sweden. This reliquary was opened in 2014 and the bones within it were examined, with some startling evidence emerging from the scientific analysis, and in this video I want to talk about that. But first things first, who was St. Erik? Well, he was a 12th century Swedish king, and in the numerical numbering of Swedish monarchs he is reckoned to be King Erik IX, although he is commonly known as Erik the Holy. And with St. Bridget, he came to be considered one of the patron saints of Sweden in the late Middle Ages. A bit like St. Edward the Confessor in England, whose shrine and relics remain intact in Westminster Abbey, the late 16th century Swedish reformers couldn't quite bring themselves to destroy the bones of a king who was still very much part of the foundation myth of Sweden, and so his bones remained within Uppsala Cathedral, although veneration of them as holy relics ceased, that is, until modern times. The present reliquary, in which the relics of St. Erik are kept, is made of silver gilt and is a wonderful example of Renaissance silversmithing. It was purchased in the 1570s, commissioned by Catherine, the Polish Catholic Queen of King Johann III. It was made to replace the medieval reliquary that King Johann was forced to melt down in 1570 to pay part of a ransom for the return of the strategic castle of Elfsborg, which had been captured by the Danes in the Northern 7 Years' War. We'll come on to the design of this 1570s reliquary and look at its contents in a moment. Before looking inside the reliquary to see what it contains, I want to explore a little of the life of St. Erik the Holy, why he was revered and became so important to the spiritual and cultural life of Sweden. Well, it is rather extraordinary for a figure of such significance, but very little is really known with any certainty about Erik or his time as King of Sweden. Indeed, there is no real documentary evidence of his life from the period of his reign. He was without question a real person and a real king, for we know he died in May of 1160, but we are not sure when he was born. It may have been around 1125. We don't know with any certainty who his father and mother were, although it has been suggested that his father was a noble called Jedvard. We don't even know how long he reigned for. He may have begun his rule in 1156 at the death of King Sverker I, but he may have been co-king with Sverker from around 1150. His life story is very murky indeed, but then Swedish history in this period is rather obscure. The kingdom was not at this point an entirely cohesive political entity. Kings' reigns were often brief and they ended violently. There were many co-kings or rival kings of different clans, and there were constant succession crises. What is certain is that Erik founded a royal dynasty which ruled on and off in Sweden until around 1220. Erik's son Knut Eriksson was a much more successful ruler than his father, and he ruled Sweden from 1173 until 1195, and it was Knut who first promoted the saintly cult of his father. St. Erik was never formally canonised by the Pope, which was not uncommon in this period, but his feast day appeared in local calendars from the later part of the reign of Knut. All the other biographical details we have of Eric come to us through the official hagiography, the holy story which was written at the time that Eric's cult was being promoted by Canute and his descendants. The hagiography is entitled the Vita Sancti Erici, the life of St. Eric. The earliest surviving version of this text is found in a Swedish breviary, a prayer book for a priest of the later 13th century, which is now in the British Library in London. A slightly longer version of the hagiography is found in the Register of Uppsala Cathedral, dating from 1344, and to it is appended a record of 52 miracles that are said to have taken place at Eric's shrine. Among those healed or assisted by St. Eric was a later king of Sweden, Birger Magnusson, and a range of others from churchmen to ordinary layfolk. The evidence of such miracles was an important element in the promotion and stabilisation of a saintly cult. It still is today in the Vatican's process of canonization. There is a third version of the Vita that is preserved in a Vatican manuscript of the 15th century, and that is it. These are the only three sources of this text known to us. The Vita begins by addressing the circumstances in which Eric becomes king. He is elected, we are told, as was common at the time, by the nobles and acclaimed by the populace. Christianity was still becoming established in Sweden in the 12th century, and Eric is presented as the archetypal Christian king. He builds churches, he upholds Christian justice, and he rids Sweden of paganism. He is described as a chaste man, a man who lives an ascetic lifestyle, dresses in a hair shirt, and controls his physical and sexual urges by bathing in cold water. The high point in his story is the Christian crusade against the pagans in Finland, during which many Finns were baptized and the Christian faith was firmly established there. In the text, Eric's life comes to a sticky end in the 10th year of his reign, when Magnus, the son of the King of Denmark, claims his throne, allying himself with malevolent forces within Sweden. They launch an attack against Eric at Uppsala on Ascension Day, the 18th of May, 1160. The Vita tells us that on that day Eric receives communion at Mass before facing his adversaries, and although he fought bravely, Eric was killed by a mob who inflicted wound after wound on his body until he lay on the field half dead. Then they taunted him and cut off his head. The outline of the story is standard fare for hagiographies of kings' saints, and it would be reasonable to take the evidence of the Vita with a pinch of salt. Eric throughout is presented as a good, pious, upright Christian king who is martyred, defending his Christian realm against the heathen. His story has echoes in the lives of other saint kings, for example that of St. Edmund of East Anglia. Eric was initially buried at Old Uppsala, in a church he had founded that is set among the striking burial mounds of early Swedish kings. The church is still there. At the beginning of his reign, his son Canute constructed a new church on the site of his father's assassination, and this became the site of present-day Uppsala Cathedral. It was only in 1273, by which time Eric's cult had been long established and his exploits had become the stuff of legends, that his relics were then moved from Old Uppsala to the cathedral in New Uppsala. So then, let's take a look at the reliquary in the cathedral and have a peek inside it. As I said at the beginning of the video, the shrine is set in one of the radiating side chapels on the north side of the choir of the cathedral. The present reliquary, which is made of 75 pounds of silver, which has been partly gilt in places, was the gift of Queen Catherine in the 1570s. This reliquary is in the form of a church with a little spire on its top, and it was the work of the goldsmiths William Boy and Hans Rosenfeld. It is decorated with figures of angels on the front and with the sort of decorative strapwork that is typical of the later 16th century. The reliquary is now protected behind a locked wrought iron case and is doubly protected within that by a glass case. And this is now set on a stone plinth at the east end of this side chapel. But until the late 20th century, this case which has doors that open outwards, was set under the arch directly to the north of the high altar of the cathedral, so it could be seen from both the high altar and the ambulatory. This is the top spot for burial in a medieval Catholic church. It seems that this had been the shrine's location from the very beginning. This engraving from the 1690s shows the shrine as it was then, the present reliquary being set in an iron cage with a solid roof, with a large crown suspended over the shrine. Also depicted in this engraving, hanging above the shrine, is a large late 15th century painting by Bernd Notke, showing pilgrims to the medieval shrine of St Eric. This is the only depiction we have of the 1435 shrine, and it shows a reliquary box, a ferretry, in the form of a church with lots of flying buttresses set on a raised plinth of similar design. Sadly, this painting, along with the high altar piece of the cathedral, which was also by Notke and depicted the story of St Eric, was destroyed in a fire in 1702 that gutted the church. Eric's reliquary and his relics were thankfully removed quickly enough, and so escaped the fire. The reliquary was last opened in 2014, and the remains of St Eric were thoroughly examined, revealing some really fascinating evidence. Inside the 16th century reliquary was a velvet-lined box, and in this the remains of the saint were wrapped in white linen. There was a skull and 23 other bones within the reliquary, so not a complete skeleton. This is not particularly surprising, given that relics of the saints were routinely distributed as gifts. Of the remaining bones, all but one were from the same male skeleton. The man was estimated to be aged between 35 and 40, to have stood at around 5'6" tall, and lived until the middle of the 12th century. All details that are consistent with the life of St Eric. Isotope analysis of the bones suggested that the individual ate a high-status diet with lots of freshwater fish. This analysis also revealed that the individual had spent the last 10 or 15 years of their life primarily at Västergötland, which is equally consistent with Eric's life. There were a couple of injuries that had healed, including one on the forehead that suggests that this individual may have been a soldier. There were also 9 or 10 sharp force injuries that evidently occurred at or near the time of death and exhibited no signs of healing. All were consistent with the sorts of wounds that might be received in a battle. One of these injuries was a bisecting cut of a cervical vertebrae, suggesting that this man had been beheaded. All the scientific evidence for the life and death of this person is utterly consistent with both the date Eric lived and the hagiographical account of St Eric's death in the Vita. Without question, these remains are Eric's. Interestingly, on one of the femurs there was some physical evidence that the bone had been scraped, perhaps to deflesh it, and there were signs too that coats of an egg white varnish had been applied to all of the bones, perhaps to consolidate and preserve them. Such practices were not uncommon in the Middle Ages for relics. Also within the coffin was preserved a rather extraordinary and spectacular artefact, a 12th century crown. Now, this crown is not a piece of royal regalia that would have been worn in life and used for a coronation. This is a funerary crown. Like other crowns of this type, and for further examples, see my video on the funerary crowns found at Vilnius in Lithuania, it's made of fairly cheap materials. It's made of copper that has then been fire gilded, covered with an amalgam of gold and mercury, and then heated up to bond the gold to the surface of the copper. This was a toxic method of gilding, as the mercury was burnt off and vaporized. The crown is made from a series of these fire gilded copper plates that have been set with artificial glass stones. These plates have then been riveted on to 2 internal copper circlets. It is likely that this is the crown that adorned Eric's head when he was first buried in Old Uppsala following his assassination, and it has followed his remains through their various translations, firstly to New Uppsala, and then from reliquary to reliquary. In its own right, this glorious 12th century crown is a second-class relic of the saint. Thanks for watching. Over on my website, yesterday I launched my antiquary calendar for next year. For 2026, the theme of this wall calendar is the medieval year, and it is illustrated in full colour with illuminations from late medieval manuscripts showing the labours of the months. It would make both a delightful and a practical gift for friends, family, or even as a treat for yourself. I have a very limited stock of these, and last year I sold out rather quickly, so if you want a chance of getting one, pop over to my website and grab one while you can. The link is in the description below.